Hello, welcome to Funding with Trust. I'm Eve Omala. Today we want to talk about something that's being talked about a lot in the development sector, and this is the recent USAID funding withdrawals that have sent devastating shockwaves to everyone that works in this sector. And before we could fully process what's happening in the US, the UK announced that it was redirecting its aid budget to defense spending. And Netherlands also cut aid to focus on a Netherlands first approach. So we're all wondering what's going on, what's happening to our communities. What does this all mean for us? How do we manage to work in such uncertainty? What is the future of international giving, and how did we even get here? Where do we go from here? There are so many questions that many of us might be asking, and we hope to explore some of these questions in a series of podcasts. So we'll feature voices from the front lines and experts with deep experience in the sector. But today, our focus is going to be on the impact of these funding cuts, how they are affecting our communities, the organizations on ground, and how national governments and donors are responding. To discuss this with me today, my special guest is Fiona Byarugaba. Fiona, you do so much behind the scenes at Funding with Trust, but I've been eager to have you on this podcast for a while now. And given your first-hand experience in Africa and your work with nonprofits like Grameen Foundation, there is so much that our audience can learn from you. Welcome to Funding with Trust.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Eve. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, first, how are you processing all of these disruptions to this sector, and how are you even keeping sane?
Honestly, Eve, it's overwhelming. The development sector has always been unpredictable, but this moment feels particularly heavy. I mean, there's funding freezes, shifting donor priorities, and the constant need to justify why essential services deserve to continue. It's frustrating, I think, because we're not talking about nice to have programs, but we're talking about healthcare, education, livelihoods, things that ideally shouldn't be non-negotiable. In terms of how I'm processing it, I try to remind myself that, at the heart of it, this work was never about the institutions or the funding cycles. At its core, it's always been about the people and the communities driving change. That's what helps me refocus. Instead of getting stuck in the anxiety of what's next, I try to ask myself, who's doing the work, with or without the funding, and how can we support them in new ways? So I also lean into community. So conversations like this, staying connected to people who are committed to rethinking how we are doing this work. And I step back when I need to because burnout is real.
Yeah. I've taken a thing or two from your approach.
Yeah, in saying that though, the disruptions are real, but so is the innovation. Every time a funding door closes, grassroots organizations find a way to keep going. And that just reminds us that the power isn't just in the money, it's mostly in the people doing the work.
And we saw that with COVID, many of them bounced back really strong. Yes. So we know that they can work through this, but it's just right now, of course, that uncertainty that we are all wondering about.
Yeah, put people together to fight against a big problem and you'll have results. But before we dive into this discussion, Eve, what is a funding freeze? Could you maybe explain what that means in a bit more detail for those who might not be fully up to speed on the situation?
Yes, so in January this year, the Trump administration issued a stop work order affecting USAID, or the United States Agency for International Development, and its funded programs, including PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. This directive led to the suspension of numerous foreign aid initiatives, including critical health programs, and nearly $60 billion is frozen. And we've had cycles of it being unfrozen and now being frozen. So, these organizations just do not know what to do and where to go from here. But even more shocking is that just this week, the UK's Prime Minister announced that he would fund an increase in UK's defense spending by cutting its aid budget from 0.5% of their gross national income to 0.3% in 2027. So it's a cut of around £6 billion.
Wow.
That's a lot of money.
It is.
And, to even make things worse, the Dutch government revealed plans to cut its annual development aid budget by €2.4 billion starting 2027. So we're all wondering, with these funding cuts, what exactly is going to happen?
Yeah, I guess what I'm interested in understanding a bit more from you, Eve, is what are you hearing directly from communities? What's the impact? Are we seeing clinics closing? Would you say the real impact is still to come? What's happening on the ground?
So, of course, there are some immediate impacts that we're seeing, and there are things that we're anticipating will be happening in just the very near-term future. The first thing I would like to highlight is we're already seeing disruptions in HIV treatment. People are genuinely worried about where their HIV treatment is going to be coming from. Some organizations only have a 2-month supply of ARVs and are limiting longer drug refill requests and only providing ARVs, these antiretrovirals, only when patients are stocked out. We have 26 million people living with HIV on the African continent. And uninterrupted access to clinical care is not just important, it is critical and vital to their survival.
Absolutely.
Any disruptions in their treatment only increases the risk of them developing resistance to their medications. It increases their viral loads, and it makes them more susceptible to illnesses. In fact, I saw something, the Andelson Office of Public Policy has this report where they estimate that in Uganda, every day that PEPFAR funding is suspended, there will be 41 new HIV infections among infants in Uganda. 41.
That's wild.
It's staggering. And not to mention that we're all anticipating disruptions in supply chain for essential medicines, shortages in malaria, in TB, in family planning drugs, because many of these were being made available through USAID money. In fact, some organizations are already starting to plan ahead and contacting pharmaceutical companies to see if they can have access to medicines very cheaply. And in Uganda, I've heard that 3 million doses of malaria vaccines that were donated by USAID were due to start being administered to 1.5 million children in April this year. But that, of course, has been paused because the funding is nowhere. This was a major breakthrough in a country where, in 2023, 12.6 million malaria cases were reported. And that's according to the World Health Organization, of which 15,000, actually close to 16,000 of these resulted in deaths. So, as someone who has had malaria myself, I was getting excited that finally there is a breakthrough, there is a vaccine coming, and we could put this to an end. We could see malaria completely dealt with. And I wanted to ask you, Fiona, have you had malaria?
I have. I absolutely have. I'm still processing the wild statistics you've just shared there. My goodness. Yes, I've had malaria. Growing up in Uganda and going to boarding school, malaria was just a part of life. I've had it multiple times, in fact. Sometimes mild, sometimes severe. I've experienced the fever, the chills, the body aches, the ones that feel like they're never ending. And I'm sure you're familiar with the quinine, which takes away your hearing temporarily. Yes, I've had it before.
So what's worse, malaria or COVID-19? Because I'm sure we've both had both and we've experienced those symptoms.
Oh my goodness. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think they're different, but they show the same inequities. And by that, I mean, the comparison isn't just about the symptoms. It's about the response. So COVID-19 was devastating, but you saw how the world reacted with urgency and money and vaccines. Suddenly research programs were accelerated, whereas malaria has been a crisis for decades and it's still killing hundreds, in fact, thousands of people every year, mostly
Millions.
in Africa, without the same global emergency response. So If you ask me personally, I'd say malaria feels like an old enemy. You keep fighting. It takes you out for days, sometimes weeks. But because it's so common where we grew up in Uganda, it's not treated with the same level of alarm. So I'd say the real issue isn't which is worse. I guess it's why malaria still exists at this scale when we have the knowledge and tools to fight it.
Oh my, it's just hard to imagine. But just carrying on with some of the impacts we're seeing. The other thing is people's livelihoods have been taken away. The president of the Uganda Medical Association told journalists that over 2,000 medical workers were affected by these USAID funding cuts. And we've heard in many other countries that people have lost their jobs. Many people. These are families that are relying on this for their livelihood. And also, some of the partners that we support who are not directly affected by the funding cuts and are still able to provide healthcare services are actually already starting to see an influx of patients coming to their health facilities because where they were previously going, the doors have been shut. And they too, these partners who are coming in to try and fill this gap, don't really have the budgets to sustain that increase in patient numbers. This is not sustainable at all.
No, it's not. I'm curious, have any organizations been affected, whether directly or indirectly or even to varying degrees? Can you share any stories that would help illustrate what's really at stake?
Yes, I've spent the last few weeks catching up with a number of organizations we support at Partners for Equity, and some have had to immediately stop or alter existing programs. For example, one of the partners we support implements a maternal and child health program in one of the African countries, and they're working in a region that's grappling with high food insecurity. So the program was funded using USAID money, and it was initially meant to run until November this year. But these funding disruptions have, of course, meant to them that they've had to hold this program. And what the program was doing specifically is that they were providing livelihood training, agriculture inputs, and cash transfers, benefiting over 4,000 people considered food insecure. These are mostly pregnant and lactating mothers and their children. They'd also made some financial commitments to suppliers for seeds and food. The products had been supplied, and now these suppliers are knocking at their door for money, for their payments. So imagine what they're going through right now. But even more devastating, one of our other partners shared that the collection and testing of HIV lab samples from health facilities to the central lab has been halted in the country where they operate. And what's happening is that the district has a collection center where blood tests from all health facilities, and these are HIV blood tests, are collected before being taken to the central lab in the capital city to test for viral loads and infant exposure to HIV. All of this has been stopped, and all of this, of course, was funded using USAID money. This means that, they can't really start exposed infants on ARVs, and they also can't be able to determine effective treatment plans for infected patients if they can't determine the viral loads. And they too only have a 2-month supply for ARVs. So what do? Do they chase their patients away? They don't have the money to sustain this, and they're all wondering, what's happening after this. But also, I think the last thing I want to touch on here, because we could go on and on about what the organizations we support are going through, but there is this thing about the relationship between these organizations and their communities. You see, most of these services are provided through community-led organizations who have strong and solid relationships with their communities. And, any relationship is going to be damaged if you come and tell me that I can no longer deliver on my promise. These organizations set up shop with a promise to these people that we shall bring services to you. We are bringing quality healthcare to you. But now they are having to go tell these same people, you know what? We are shutting our doors. You're breaking the hearts of people that have actually put their trust in you. Imagine how badly that can damage that relationship. And Fiona, you've been on the grantee side before as well. And I was just curious, if you were in this situation, how would you face your beneficiaries to tell them that you're no longer delivering these essential services?
This is a nightmare scenario, whichever way you look at it. You know, that trust you were talking about between organizations and their communities had to have been built over a number of years.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, funding cuts don't just slow down projects. They stop critical services, they lay off staff, and they erode trust with the communities that are relying on them. I think I would approach it from a human-centered perspective, because I believe organizations have a duty of care in the way they deliver this news. I think in the medical world, they call it bedside manner. I guess, and this is a tough one because it's not down to an exact science, but the immediate response would probably be triage, figuring out how to stretch existing resources. I mean, I was just listening to you talking about the 2-month supply of ARVs that some of these communities have. How do you stretch that out as best as you can? You know, prioritizing what absolutely cannot stop and reaching out to any potential alternative funders. But I know that only just buys time. You know, the emotional toll is quite big. Teams have to tell people that the care they relied on, whether it's malaria treatment, maternal health services, ARVs, community clinics might not be there in the next month. I mean, Eve, it's devastating. I think what it highlights more than anything is moments like this show how fragile traditional funding models are.
Yes.
You know, if large institutions can cut funding overnight, then organizations need more diversified and flexible funding streams. But let me ask you, let me turn this to you. How are you seeing funders responding? Are there any private organizations trying to mitigate the impact, or is it more of a wait and see approach? What are you seeing?
Yeah, funders have some crucial decisions to make in the coming months because, of course, all eyes are on them, how they come in to fill this gap and ensure that critical services are reinstated. But first and foremost, what I've seen is that many funders have actually reached out to their grantee partners to understand how they've been affected, how they are doing, just checking in on their general well-being. We've all got a human side to us, and I've been quite proud of many funders that they recognize that in this, we all have feelings. We are human first, and they are genuinely reaching out to ensure that these, visionary leaders they support are actually doing well and, are handling this the best way that they ought to. And I've seen some that are actually pausing the addition of new grantee partners to focus on using those funds to fill the gaps that are experienced by grantees in their portfolios. And it's a reasonable and thoughtful step to take because you want to sustain the activities of organizations that you have a long and standing relationship with. Of course, that would, it would be painful to the ones who have gone through these due diligence processes only to be told, sorry, we can't take you on when you're on the very tail end of entering their portfolios. But we also realize that they have to, take care of the ones that they've already invested in and ensure that they are not having a hold into the services that they provide. But also I've seen that some, funder intermediaries like Blood Water Mission have actually launched initiatives to raise funding for organizations on the front lines so they can continue sustaining community health infrastructure.
That's somewhat comforting to hear. I mean, in as much as it can help, really. Where do our governments come in? What role do you think they should play in addressing this crisis? So, are there, active advocacy efforts happening? Do you think increased pressure from communities that have been affected can make a difference?
We are yet to really determine what many of these African governments are doing. But in countries like Malawi, I'll highlight Malawi because the Minister of Health gave assurance that the country has sufficient stocks of HIV medication. And a few other countries have come out to say the same, that at least, there is disruptions here with essential medicines. But we shall be able to at least see to it that for the next few months, not years, for the next few months, HIV/AIDS medications are available for the patients that need them. But the challenge, though, is that we've seen that lots of staff in this sector have either lost their jobs or been granted a leave of absence. So what I'm really wrestling with here is that if there is a shortage of healthcare staff, even if medicines are available through these governments, if these governments are guaranteeing that ARVs won't be affected, who is going to dispense the medication? Who is going to conduct the CD4 counts? I mean, there is no staff. What about the logistics to deliver these drugs countrywide? You see, so all these things are interlinked, and we need to look at the entire infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, where the gaps are and how we can collectively, address these gaps. And, both governments and local organizations need to find long-term sustainable solutions that can withstand these shocks. How is it that a funding freeze can hold progress overnight?
Yeah.
What are we missing here? And that's a conversation I would love us to touch on, not now, but in a future podcast, because as you mentioned, what are we doing to keep these organizations alive, even beyond grant funding?
The numbers are... You shared really stark numbers there, and it's easy to default to a helpless state. But I want us to try and think about ways to help. How can I help? If I'm listening to Eve and Fiona on this podcast right now, what would you say I can do to help? What are the most immediate needs right now? Is it about funding? Is it advocacy? Is it pressuring policymakers? What's the most effective action people can take right now?
First and foremost, I think it's important for all of us to stay informed, stay abreast of what's happening, and advocate for local communities and organizations on the front lines. We've been seeing a lot of silence, which has also, that's another thing that is mind-boggling. But this is the time to speak up, because we are dealing with people here. People's lives are going to be lost if nothing changes. But secondly, if possible, I would love to really encourage people to support the work of these organizations, again, that are on the front lines. They are in the middle of the collapse of their communities. We know that they aren't going anywhere. When COVID happened, people packed up. They stayed. They are here to stay, and we need to back them during this critical time. They cannot shut their doors, because they are the first people that the community runs to when a crisis like this happens. But also, lastly, let's stay unified, work together to strengthen the sector. There is a real risk of the industry turning on itself. We're hearing of lawsuits being filed between development contractors in the US and even globally. But all of this is just continuing to fragment the sector and to rip us apart. We don't need that right now. In fact, I'll conclude with an African proverb that says, sticks in a bundle are unbreakable.
That's right.
And the summary of that is, let's stick together and counter this crisis with unity.
Well said. Well said, Eve. So what should we expect next?
In our next episodes, because we want to do a series of these, we want to shift the conversation to resilience. It's not all about the doom and gloom that we're seeing. We've talked about the vulnerabilities that these organizations are facing, but where are the resilient communities that we've for long talked about? What sustainability strategies are they implementing beyond aid? What solutions are helping them recover and adapt? And most importantly, what can we all learn from this crisis? We hope that as we carry on with these conversations, we will bring leaders that are experienced in this sector and are working through, how we can build more resilience, how we can bounce back even stronger. So stay tuned for that. And Fiona, I would like to thank you for having this conversation with me. It's really been great talking to you.
Same. It's been fantastic talking about these very difficult topics that are necessary to just spar about and solutionize.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. I know this has been a tough conversation, but I hope all of you are really taking care of yourselves and have somebody to talk through if you're having it really hard. You've been listening to Funding with Trust, and I hope you've learned a thing or two from our conversation today. Tune in for our next episode, and don't forget to send me your feedback by emailing hello@fundingwithtrust.org. I'm Eve Omala, and catch you next time. Bye-bye.